All right, I'm set up for painting. Although my space might move around a little bit, I have my finished sketch with it split into sections. I have my pan, I have a cup of water, my 2 paintbrushes, both the flat and the round, and a paper towel. So I am ready to get started. All right, so when I'm working on my painting, I need to think about what techniques I'm going to use. You're going to use at least 3 techniques. Variegated wash needs to be one of those techniques. Then the other 2 you can choose. I am choosing salt and glaze. So first thing I'm going to do is add some water to the paints that I am using. I found that I really like working with the yellow as my lightest. Since everyone has to do a variegated wash, you have to figure out what your lightest valued color is, and in the pan it's yellow. I'm going to use red as my medium. I'm going to use blue as my dark. I may need something to represent black, so I'm going to put just a little bit of water in the brown here. Clean my paintbrush off, dry it off, and get started. So if you're a little bit nervous, it might be easier if you get started in a space that is negative space. So you'll be filling in the negative space, the background, with paint. You'll be filling this in with one of your techniques. So I'm going to use variegated wash and glaze in my actual object, and I'm going to use salt in the background to make that more interesting. So I have my salt, I'm ready to go, and I'm going to go for a dark background so that everything really stands out. So I'm actually going to use this brown for my background. Something that I can do to ensure that my paint stays wet just a little bit longer is I can paint water on my paper. Now I'm not making a puddle, I'm just getting the paper a little wet. And I'm going right up to that pencil line, but not over it. I'm going to pick up some paint and then spread that in there. Remember, this is that flat wash technique that we utilized before. It allows you to fill in a space. It will lighten your color. It won't make the color as bright. So you'll want to consider that while you're working on this. I'm going to drop a little bit of salt in there. All right, now I'm going to paint my next section. And this is a small section, so I'm just going to go straight paint here. And since it's a small section, I am going to use my round brush because it has a point and I can follow along the edge of my line. And be really careful about how I'm painting. Now in my true background here, I've got quite a bit of space to cover, so I'm going to wet that space. Okay, so now I'm going to add some salt. Okay, I'm going to push the salt off of the sections that I don't need them. And move on. Let that dry. Now my next section, you would think, oh yeah, I'm gonna paint my positive space over here. But if any of my wet paint gets into the negative space sections, what's going to happen? It's going to bleed, you're right. So instead of painting this section here, I'm gonna paint the negative space section down here. That way I can get all of my negative space sections done and not have wet watercolor touching wet watercolor like I would if I had the potential to, if I would paint this section here right next to these wet sections here. So I'm going to go ahead and paint my negative space sections all the same. These are the finished negative space sections. So the next thing I'm going to do is paint my positive spaces. and I am going to think about the highlights and shadows on this object to paint it using my different values of color. Now, if you're a little confused about how to do highlights and shadows and different values of your object, one thing that you can do is take your object and change its saturation. Now, my chair happens to be yellow, red, and blue. So when I adjust my saturation, it stays within the same light value as the yellow spaces, medium value is the red spaces, and blue value is the darker spaces. So I'm gonna go ahead and paint it that way. Now, I told you you needed to have 3 different techniques. So I've already used salt. Now I'm going to do a variegated transition. You should work top down so that you're not working on top of things that are wet. So right now I'm working in an area that what's below it is a little wet, so I have to keep my hand off to the side. But really your goal is to have these areas dry before you move on. You want to avoid wet paint touching wet paint, or else it's going to bleed. If that does happen, quick blot it with a paper towel, and that will help stop the bleed a little bit. So now in this section here, I have some blue, so I'm going to add blue and just let it bleed into that red. Because in my photo, the blue paint really just drips down and bleeds into the red paint on the chair, like in real life. Now I could move on to the next spot in this positive space, but this red section is wet. So if I paint here and here, what do you think is going to happen as the wet paint touches wet paint? It will bleed, exactly. So I'm not going to paint these sections right now. I'm going to move over here and paint this positive space section while that's drying. This is just time management while painting. So again, I have a red leg to the chair, or support to the chair. I'm gonna not worry about that white space. You may have noticed that there's like a weird white space on this part of the chair. I'm going to creatively edit that out. On the inner edge, this chair is a little darker, so I'm going to just pick up a tiny amount of blue and then add that into my wet paint so it bleeds a tiny bit into that red. Now that red spot is wet, so I don't want to paint this, but I can paint this here, and it's yellow. Consider shadows so your object is going to look flat. So now everything that I can paint in these sections is touching something that's wet, so I'm going to move on to the next section. Okay, now while this dries down here, I'm going to be working on this section up here, which is a lot of yellow with some blue mixed in. So I'm going to continue to add in the Variegated Wash to allow these colors to blend. Variegated Wash can help add detail. It can also create highlights and shadows. Variegated Wash is a technique really where you're putting wet paint into wet paint. Alright, so my next section is going to be over here. Just like when I was painting this section down here, this section has a slight bit of a shadow along the side here and along the side here, and red is my next valued color, so I'm going to take a tiny bit of red and blend that into my yellow. Even though the shadow isn't red, there's not red there. Red is my next valued color. So if you're working with this, where yellow is your light, red is your medium, and blue is your dark, I'm adding a slight shadow here by adding some red. Here you can see how I bounce back and forth from one section to another as I wait for parts of my painting to dry. I can go from one positive space to another positive space, adding in detail and color. Every time you add color, it should be to add a new value, to add a shadow, to add a highlight, especially with your objects that don't have yellow, red, and blue in them like my chair does. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do is add some glazes to my watercolor here, because there are some areas that need to be a little bit darker. So what I did is I took some paint from my pan, put it on my palette paper. If you don't have palette paper, you could use the lid of a Tupperware container. I added that paint from my pan to my palette paper and added more and more and more water as I got farther away from the initial spot of paint. That will allow me to pick up really watery paint and add it as layers on top of my dry paint. So I know I need a little bit of a shadow along the edge here. Highlights, shadows, multiple values are the ways to create the illusion of form. So on your piece, you should have at least 3 values: a light, a medium, and a dark. And in my painting, I'm using yellow as my light, red as my medium, and blue as my dark. All right, so this is the conclusion of my painting. I have negative space, positive space, and all of the details in those positive spaces. Now you've seen the whole process from start to finish, and you'll be able to make your own painting just like I made mine. But really consider those colors that you are using and what's going to represent your lightest value, your darkest value, and your medium value. Really think about those painting techniques, what you're good at, what you're not so good at. Ignore those and use the ones that you're good at. Paint carefully and think through your process.